Welcome to Red Eye Story Hour for tales told after midnight. I'm your host and author, R.J. Burley, and today we're reading part 3 from chapter 9 of Outcast, the first book in the Mountain Warrior series. I hope you enjoy. I was about to breathe a sigh of relief, but I caught my breath as I remembered the errant arrow that had whistled above my head. That was when I heard the laughter of two men who sounded uncannily close. I wheeled back to the direction I was just facing, and there they were, sitting on a log, casually observing me from less than 40 meters. They were dressed in a mix of brown buckskin and camouflage. It appeared that they weren't hiding. I had just been too panicked to see what was in front of me earlier, so that as they sat in their outdoorsy clothes, they were all but invisible to me until they wished to be seen. They stood up, still laughing. Each held a homemade longbow. With the laughter, archery stuff, and woodsy clothes, I may have confused them with Robin Hood's merry men, were it not for the anachronistic assault rifles strapped to their shoulders, ready for emergencies, and their eyes, which were not merry. Yes, the corners of their eyes crinkled with laughter, but something beyond their pupils told a different story. Looking deep into their eyes, I could tell these were killers. They may not have been as evil as Don, but 2 years in the rough, the windows of their soul told me that they had had to kill to survive. One was a short, almost fat man, fat for the quarantine area, about 55 years old. He wore a ball cap and a crooked manner on his head. Not like the hipster trying to be cool, but rather like a redneck who just didn't care what people thought of him. He placed a baseball bat over one shoulder and set down his longbow. He had a beard about halfway down his chest. He laughed and took off his cap. He ran his hand over his bald head as if somehow that would get him to regain his composure. It didn't. I later learned his name was Scott. I don't think he was actually related to anyone in the tribe, but they referred to him as Uncle Scott nonetheless. Scott said in a thick accent, "Damn, son, I ain't never saw someone so scared of their dinner." The accent wasn't quite the lofty, beautiful southern drawl. It was similar in some ways, but harsher, like the black sheep of the family. The shock of numbness began to leave me. I felt my anger arising, but told myself to keep it in check so my impulsive nature didn't get me killed. I took him to be a dumbass with his thick accent, which sounded foreign to my northeast coast ears. Having a dumbass speak down to me is probably my biggest pet peeve. However, the AK-47 slung over his back scared the hell out of me. It wasn't so much the gun, it was his casual acquaintance with it. The military police who escorted me carried theirs with a tension that screamed of anger and fear. Yet this guy didn't seem to have a care in the world. I had a feeling he could draw the weapon and shoot me and not even pause in his laughter. But thankfully, he didn't seem inclined. The other man was tall, lean, mid-30s, longish hair and short beard. I did a double take. He kind of looked like that father on the drone footage I watched back in the bar. If the man in the video hadn't surely met his death to the zombies, I may have seriously thought it was him. However, this guy didn't have that determined look. He looked like some mellow hippie. But I guess most people out here look like this due to the lack of hygiene in beauty salons. He had a black assault rifle strapped over his back. I later learned it was an AR-15. A katana sword was sheathed at his side. The hippie just nodded his head as a response to Scott's laughter. I later learned the hippie's name was Brian. "Do you men live around here?" I asked. "Nope," said Brian. Even with his monosyllabic speech, he didn't seem to have an accent I could pinpoint. "Really?" I asked curiously. "No," said the short fat one in the worst imitation of a New York accent ever. "A freaking helicopter just dropped us off too like it did with yous." Both men laughed again. They then approached me casually. It reminded me of a video from a safari in Africa. I saw 3 lions confidently approach a Cape buffalo in an almost friendly yet playful manner. They circled it, and within a minute they were devouring the poor animal alive. "Who are you guys?" I demanded. "No," Brian said. "Who are you to come to our land? Why is a man who is so afraid of a squirrel and a deer made an outcast to the civilized world?" "I am Eric Hildebrand. I got caught sneaking into the—" I hesitated to call their home the Forbidden Zone. I eventually just said zone. "Hildebrand. Like Governor Peckerhead," said Scott. He had a way of saying everything in a tone as if it were a joke. Usually, just crudely calling someone a peckerhead would have no effect on me. But even in the circumstance, I found something funny about him. Had the circumstances been different, I may have laughed aloud. Scott continued, "No wonder you ain't shot." "This isn't punishment. I'm a journalist," I stated. It wasn't the truth, but I wasn't going to appear like a victim. "Of course," Brian said dismissively. "What happened to your face?" I remembered how bruised it was, so I thrust out my chest and boldly stated, "You should see the face on the other guy." Scott laughed and gently pushed me aside. He and Brian, without asking, and with the casualness of the lions, tore through my backpack. Actually, it was more like the bear from the night before, except they unbuttoned and unzipped rather than savaged my pack with taloned claws. I felt just as powerless as I did last night, especially without the bear spray. After a moment, I grew angry enough at the careless way they threw all my stuff all over the place, and I stepped forward to stop them. But Brian looked at me and shook his head. There was no threat, no words. In fact, he smiled in a friendly manner. The shake of his head seemed to imply, without saying aloud, "We both know you don't have the balls to stop me." I gritted my teeth, knowing he was right. "What the hell is all this?" demanded Scott. He held up a telescopic lens that was over 12 inches long and looked through it. "Dadgum, this is almost as big as my pecker." Brian looked at me with a hint of concern. "You won't last a day out here, man. You have little food, no weapons." "I have this knife," I said, holding up the multi-tool with the 3-inch blade. "About the size of your pecker," Scott laughed. Brian rolled his eyes as if pecker was the only topic of conversation that Scott engaged in. He then looked pointedly at me. "Dude, they set you up to die." I said, "My mission is to meet up with people like yourselves and film how you survive, like the show Survivor Man or something." Brian said, "That's been done to death even before all this went down." He had a hint of sympathy in his voice. "I don't think this will be as glamorous as you appear to think." "Yeah, but what you do is real. I mean, picture it." I knew it looked cheesy, but I was desperate as I held both thumbs and forefingers up in a rectangle like a television and looked through it as I said, "You're doing something like lighting a fire, primitively. Yeah, it's been done to death, but then just as the viewers get bored, a zombie attacks." I know what I did sounds melodramatic, but I was hoping these people with such little hope would be bedazzled. I was counting on being the savior to give some meaning to their lives. Scott laughed hysterically. "That's got to be the stupidest thing I done never heard of." I had a feeling Scott purposely spoke horrible grammar for shock value. Everything about him seemed to be an act to get a rise out of someone. I couldn't tell if I found him to be annoying or funny. Maybe a little of both, and that's probably why I wasn't sure. Brian casually leaned against a tree with a sad smile that showed that he was acting polite, but that he fully agreed with what Scott said. "Oh, crap," I exclaimed as I saw a human form lurching towards us. Scott and Brian had their backs to the thing. Its putrid flesh was falling off of it, and I could catch a faint scent of the decaying humanity. I could see the facial muscles where the skin had fallen away, as well as a few molars. Were it clothed, I would not have been able to tell that it was male, but even that member was probably days from completely falling off from the rot. "What's the matter?" asked Brian. The horror of it overwhelmed my nervous system, and all I could say was literally, as I pointed. "Son, what in the holy hell is a wah-wah?" asked Scott. I muttered some more unintelligible syllables. The monster was 10 feet behind him. In a seemingly single motion, Brian lazily leaned forward to get his back off the tree, turned to face the zombie, and drew his sword, slicing the zombie's head off. It happened so fast that I stood there staring for a moment as I digested what I had just witnessed. As soon as the headless thing hit the ground, Brian pulled out a cloth and an unlabeled plastic water bottle. He then wiped down his sword using a brownish liquid from the water bottle that looked to be antiseptic. It smelled something like Listerine, except a little more astringent. "I was wondering when he'd get here," Brian said with a bored voice. Scott chimed in. "These rotters like this headless guy here are probably days from falling apart. They don't move so fast." "Yeah," Brian agreed. "We saw him standing against a tree in sleep mode." Scott looked at Brian and said, "And he would have stayed that way if idiot here didn't wake him up with that damn whirlybird. By the way, Nimrod, next time you see a zombie, don't say, 'Whoa, whoa.' Say, 'Hey guys, there's a zombie behind you.'" Now that the immediate danger was behind me, I realized that I needed these two. I could not spend the night alone in these woods and expect to survive without them. "So what about the documentary?" I asked. "Interested?" "What in the holy hell do we get out of it?" demanded Scott with a mocking laugh. "You get your name out there, to the public." "Your public," I answered, but I saw it wasn't selling. I put on a cheesy showman's voice and dramatically spread my arms for comical effect. "Fame, fortune, you get to keep up with the Kardashians," I joked. They looked at me confused. Finally, Scott asked, "The car what in the hells?" Brian shook his head. "Sorry, bro. This just isn't going to work. You'll most likely be dead by morning, so we'll just take your food," Brian said, motioning to my pack as if it were already a done deal. "What? The hell you will," I said, more in panic than anger. "You done scared that deer and caused us to miss the shot," Scott explained. "That was our tribe's dinner tonight. Brian's got to feed his kids. You owe us, peckerhead. Besides," Brian said, "I highly suspect you as a spy with all that recording equipment." Brian and Scott started pocketing my camping food. "Who the hell would want to spy on a bunch of hillbillies?" I asked. It wasn't a nice thing to say. I later learned that hillbilly is similar to the N-word in these mountains. However, in the moment, my emotions had taken over my reason. Scott barely spoke between chortling. "Some loser trash whose society bashed his face up and discarded him from a whirlybird, obviously." That was like a hot iron spike driven into my chest. I felt an impulsive rage wash over me. They could insult me, but they couldn't just steal all the stuff I had left in this world. Brian could see it. He smirked at me. I could tell he was purposely pressing my buttons. It worked. My grip tightened on the small knife, and I charged at Brian. Although I had some training in martial arts, I was fueled by pure brainless rage and desperation. Brian calmly stepped aside and kicked my foot out as I barreled past him. I sprawled onto the leafy forest floor and lost my knife. I sprang to my feet and charged again. Swinging my fist at his smug face, Brian easily ducked the blow. I saw a smile on his face as he drew his sword. The blunt hit pressed deep against my abdomen, and I felt the wind knocked out of my lungs. Brian moved behind me, and I found myself with the back of my head against his chest. I wound up in something like a headlock, but instead of his forearm, the blade of his sword was pressed against my throat. He stood with his knee lifted to support my chest. If he removed his knee, I would have fallen to the ground against the razor-sharp blade. It would have decapitated me. Scott put down his baseball bat. "Now, my friend," Brian said calmly, "you are going to calm down, okay? I was panting but afraid to speak for fear that moving my jaw would place more pressure against the blade and my throat. Having a razor-sharp blade against one's neck probably inspires more terror than a gun pointed at one's head. I felt like I was bleeding, but I couldn't touch my neck because my hands were grasping Brian's arms to support my weight and to keep my head on my shoulder. I wondered if any germs from the killing of the zombie could infect me from the sword's blade. I hoped whatever antiseptic was that he used to clean it was effective. "Okay," Brian asked again as Scott pulled the handkerchief from my pocket. "Please," I whispered. I thought I was dead as the metal sliced across my throat. I fell to the ground at his feet. My hands went to my neck. It took a moment to realize there was no blood. Brian had turned the blade so that the dull back of it, rather than the honed blade, slid across my throat. Although I survived, to this day I can still feel the cold sensation and the terror of the heartless metal moving against the skin of my throat. Scott yanked my arms behind my back and cuffed me. I offered no resistance. All of my steam was spent on the two futile charges. "Scott, cuffs the hands in front so that he can catch himself if he falls," Brian suggested. "Won't he be able to fight us with his hands in the front?" Scott asked with a sarcastic snort. Brian replied with a single huff, like a laugh. "Yeah, I heard that," Scott laughed back. With Brian's sword point indenting the skin of my back a few inches, I offered no physical resistance. However, I started screaming. "Help! Help!" Brian shook his head. "That would just attract more zombies." "Then uncuff me so I can fight him, or I'll keep yelling." Brian just shook his head, and after a moment said, "We'll need something more deadly than zombies to scare him." "Scott, give him the muffler." "Sure, Bri," Scott drawled. I curiously watched as Scott bent over and untied a fungus-ridden boot. He removed his foot that was covered by an equally fungus-covered sock. I could not even guess at the sock's original color. The manner in which he snickered started to scare me. "What are you doing?" I asked as he slowly pulled the sock off his foot. I coughed as I caught sudden wind of the stench that overrode the scent of the rotter. "Geez, have you ever changed socks in your life?" "Why should I?" Scott laughed. As he stepped forward, I blurted, "What are you doing?" He smiled, and I saw a missing tooth. He held up the sock close to my face and answered my question. "Putting a sock in it, son. Now open up as we gag you." He looked at Brian and said, "Tie the bandana around his mouth after I stick this in." My jaw clamped shut as he attempted to stick the sock in my mouth. I gagged and turned my head away from the atrocity and begged through tight lips, "Please, I will keep quiet. Please, you have my word." I dry heaved as the stinking thing touched my face. Scott gently brushed it across my cheek like a lover's caress as Brian yanked my head back, forcing my mouth to open. Brian laughed. I think he learned his lesson. "Oh," Scott whined as he held it before my open mouth for a moment. "Thank you," I said breathlessly as Scott removed the offending sock. "That would have been worse than being attacked by a zombie horde." Brian sadly agreed. Scott's eyes crinkled in an avuncular manner. "I'm starting to like you, kid. You're funny," he said with a laugh as he blindfolded me. I didn't actually mind because the blindfold was a cloth that was relatively clean. Then it hit me. I worried that the blindfold was for a firing squad. I voiced that worry. "The blindfold is so that you can't see your way to our camp," Brian said. They led me away. I stumbled a lot. I had enough trouble walking in the rocky Appalachian forest with sight. Without it, it was hell. After I stumbled a few times, Scott said in a mock reverential tone of a cheesy martial arts movie, "We take you to see Grand Master, young grasshopper." "Who is that?" I asked. "You are grasshopper." "That who is that?" Scott said. "No, I mean who is—" Scott's laugh interrupted me. Brian said in his reasonable tone. His name is Adam. He's basically our chief. He'll decide your fate, so I guess you kiss his ass when you meet him. I trudged along blindfolded to meet my fate.